She grabbed a stranger's hand in the middle of town and whispered 3 words that could ruin them both. "Pretend you're my fiancé." Dust swirled through Red Hollow as Caleb Morgan froze beside the hitching post. Amelia Brooks's fingers wrapped around his arm while 2 Whitaker men watched from the boardwalk. Her voice was barely above a breath, the cold wind carrying the sound of boots against the wooden street. Caleb had come for supplies, not trouble, but the mark on her wrist told him this was more than a desperate act. Why was this woman willing to risk everything on a cowboy she'd never met? Stay with us and discover what happened next. The morning air around Red Hollow carried the sharp smell of cold earth and pine smoke. Caleb Morgan rode into town just after 9, his dark coat covered with a thin layer of road dust, his old leather gloves worn smooth from years of work. The ride from Morgan Creek Ranch had taken nearly 3 hours. The mountain trail was quiet, the kind of quiet Caleb preferred. He came for flour, lamp oil, horseshoes, and enough supplies to get through the first heavy snow. Nothing more. That was how he liked his days. Simple, predictable. His Morgan Creek Ranch sat alone beyond the eastern hills, where the grasslands met the lower slopes of the Bitterroot Mountains. It was a small place compared to the larger cattle operations around Red Hollow, but every fence post, every stable beam, and every trail on that land carried his own hand's work. Caleb had learned a long time ago that peace was easier to find when you stayed away from other people's troubles, but trouble had a way of finding him. He noticed the crowd before he reached the general store. People stood along the wooden boardwalk, pretending they were only waiting for supplies or talking about the weather. Caleb knew better. In a small western town, silence often meant something was happening. Near the mercantile steps, a young woman stood with a folded document in her hand. Amelia Brooks. Caleb had heard her name before. Everyone in Red Hollow knew the Brooks family. Her father, Henry Brooks, had been a respected blacksmith before his passing. He had repaired wagon wheels, fixed broken tools, and helped half the town keep working through hard seasons. Now his daughter stood alone, facing 2 men wearing the same gray coats and polished boots that belonged to Thomas Whitaker's employees. One of the men tapped the paper with his finger. "Miss Brooks, you've delayed long enough. Your father's debt does not disappear because you refuse to accept reality." Amelia held the document tightly. Her voice stayed calm. "My father's land was paid for. You know that." The taller man smiled without warmth. "Your father believed many things. A few people nearby looked away. Nobody stepped forward." Caleb watched from beside the hitching rail, his hand resting loosely on his horse's reins. He knew that look, the look of people who wanted to help but were afraid of what it would cost them. The taller man stepped closer to Amelia. "You have one choice: sign the agreement, and Mr. Whitaker will make sure your future is secure." Amelia's eyes hardened. "I know exactly what kind of future he offers." The second man reached for the paper. That was when Caleb noticed the red mark around Amelia's wrist, a small thing, barely visible but enough. Something old and buried inside him shifted. 5 years ago, Caleb had watched another family lose everything because a wealthy man believed money could decide who mattered. He had promised himself he would never stand in the middle of that kind of fight again. Then Amelia looked up. Her eyes moved across the street. They found him. For a moment, Caleb thought she was simply searching for someone. Then she walked straight toward him. 4 quick steps before he could ask what she was doing. Her hand slipped around his arm. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Please, pretend you're my fiancé." Caleb looked down at her hand, then at her face. There was no performance in her eyes now, only a quiet request from someone who had run out of choices. The 2 men turned. The entire street seemed to stop moving. Caleb could have stepped away. He should have. Instead, he placed one hand gently over Amelia's and pulled her a little closer. Not enough to frighten her, just enough for everyone watching to understand. The taller man studied him. And who might you be? Caleb's expression remained steady. Caleb Morgan. The man's face changed slightly, only for a second. But Caleb noticed. You know him? The other man asked. The taller man ignored the question. He looked back at Amelia. Mr. Whitaker won't appreciate this. Amelia lifted her chin. Then tell Mr. Whitaker he can speak to me himself. The men left after a long moment. Their boots echoed against the wooden street before disappearing around the corner. Only then did Amelia slowly release Caleb's arm. I'm sorry, she said. Caleb looked at her wrist. You didn't choose me because I was the closest man standing there. Amelia followed his gaze, her expression softened. No. She looked at the faded metal badge attached to his old leather bag, a badge from a life Caleb had left behind. You chose the wrong person to lie to, Caleb said quietly. A small breath escaped her. Almost a laugh. I don't know who you are, she paused, but I know something. The wind moved through the empty street, carrying dust between the wooden buildings. Caleb waited. Amelia looked toward the office of Whitaker Cattle Company at the end of town. Mr. Whitaker is afraid of men like you. Caleb's eyes narrowed. How do you know? Amelia looked back at him, because people like him only fear the ones who remember what he has done. For the first time in years, Caleb Morgan felt the quiet life he built begin to crack. And he had the feeling Amelia Brooks was the reason. The streets of Red Hollow were already growing colder by the time Caleb led his horse away from the mercantile. The morning crowd had scattered, but the whispers had not. They followed them. A woman walking beside a cowboy she had just called her fiancé was the kind of thing people in a small western town remembered. Amelia kept her eyes forward. I owe you an explanation, she said. Caleb adjusted the leather strap holding the supplies on his saddle. You owe me more than that. She stopped walking. For a moment, she looked like she was preparing herself for anger. I know what I asked you to do. The wind moved through the wooden buildings, carrying the smell of coal smoke from the blacksmith shop down the road. I put you in the middle of something that wasn't yours. Caleb looked at her. You're right. The answer came so quickly that Amelia almost looked surprised. Then Caleb continued, but you were already standing in the middle of it alone. She lowered her eyes for just a second. That was the first time Caleb saw something beyond the strength she showed the town. Not weakness, just exhaustion. They walked toward the small diner beside the church. The place was warm, with the smell of coffee and fresh bread filling the room. An old stove burned near the wall, and a few ranch hands sat at the tables speaking quietly. Caleb ordered black coffee. Amelia ordered tea. Neither spoke until the waitress left. Thomas Whitaker wants my land, Amelia said. Caleb wrapped his hand around the coffee cup, but did not drink. That much I figured. My father owned a small piece of land near the Eastern Creek. Not much. Enough for a home. Enough for the workshop where he spent his life. She placed a folded paper on the table. Whitaker says my father borrowed money. He says the land belongs to him now. Caleb looked at the document but did not touch it. And you don't believe him? No. Her answer was immediate. My father kept every receipt, every agreement. He taught me never to sign anything I didn't understand. The confidence in her voice caught Caleb's attention. You read legal papers? Amelia gave a small nod. My father believed a person should know the words that could change their life. For a moment, Caleb remembered another time, another family, another piece of land, another man with money who thought nobody could stop him. He pushed the memory away. How long do you need me to pretend? Amelia hesitated, just long enough to stop him from forcing me into a corner. Caleb leaned back. You think being engaged to me will do that? It already did. She looked toward the window where the Whitaker office stood across the street. Those men were not trying to collect a debt. They wanted me frightened enough to surrender. The silence between them lasted several seconds. Finally, Caleb asked, "Why me?" Amelia looked at the faded badge attached to his old leather bag. "I saw it." Caleb followed her eyes. The old mountain guide badge, a reminder of a life before Morgan Creek Ranch. "You recognize that?" "No. But I recognized what it meant." She lowered her voice. "Men who work for Whitaker know every person in this territory who can be bought. They keep track of the ones who cannot." Caleb said nothing. Amelia continued, "I knew if I chose someone from town, Whitaker would already know how to pressure him. And you thought I would be harder to pressure?" A small smile appeared. "I thought you looked like a man who had already lost something important." The words landed heavier than he expected. Before Caleb could answer, the diner door opened. Margaret Morgan stepped inside carrying a basket of supplies. Caleb's older sister looked from him to Amelia, then back to him. She raised one eyebrow. That was all. Caleb already knew what she was thinking. "This is Amelia Brooks," he said. Margaret smiled politely. "I know who she is." Amelia stood. "Mrs. Morgan, I apologize for arriving like this." Margaret looked at Caleb, then at the mark still faintly visible on Amelia's wrist. Her expression changed. Not curiosity, understanding. "Come with us," Margaret said. Caleb glanced at her. "Margaret, you are not leaving a woman alone in this town after what happened." Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it, because he knew she was right. The ride to Morgan Creek Ranch took nearly an hour. The mountains grew taller around them as the wagon trail narrowed. The first snow of the season covered the highest peaks, turning them white against the gray afternoon sky. Amelia sat beside Caleb in silence. She watched the land, the fences, the horses, the small cabin standing beyond the barn. "This is where you live?" Caleb nodded. "It is." She looked around. There was nothing unnecessary: a stack of firewood, a repaired wagon wheel, a small garden already covered for winter, a place built by one pair of hands. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fireplace filled the room. Caleb placed her bag near the door. "You can stay in the spare room." Amelia looked toward the small wooden table, the neatly stacked books, the tools hanging beside the wall. "You built all this yourself? Most of it?" She touched the edge of the table, not as if inspecting, as if appreciating. "You don't leave much room for another person." Caleb looked at her. "I wasn't expecting one." The words were quiet, but they carried something neither of them spoke about. That night, snow began tapping softly against the windows. Caleb sat near the fire, repairing a bridle strap. Amelia sat across the room, reading through her father's old papers. Two strangers, two separate lives. Yet neither one felt as alone as they had that morning. Days passed slowly. Amelia helped with the horses. She learned the rhythm of the ranch. Caleb noticed she never asked to be treated gently. She carried water, fixed torn fabric, helped mend a broken fence post without waiting for permission. One morning, he found her tightening a loose gate hinge. "You know that's my job." She looked up. "So is cooking, cleaning, and staying quiet according to some people." Caleb almost smiled. "Almost. You always answer like that?" "Only when someone deserves it." For the first time in a long while, the cabin felt less empty. But Caleb kept one door closed, the small room beside the barn. Amelia noticed. She never asked, until one evening, while looking for a lantern, she found an old wooden box tucked beneath a shelf. She almost put it back. Almost, but the lid was already loose. Inside was a folded letter. The paper was yellowed with age. At the top was a name, Caleb's handwriting, and a date from 5 years earlier. She closed the box immediately, but it was too late. She had seen enough. The man everyone called cold and distant was not empty. He was carrying a goodbye he had never been able to say. That night, when Caleb returned from checking the eastern fence, Amelia was waiting by the fire. The box sat beside her. He stopped. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb quietly said, "That was not yours to open." Amelia lowered her eyes. "I know." The fire cracked between them. "I am sorry." Caleb looked at her, and for the first time since she arrived, he saw no fear in her, only respect, the kind that made a person step back instead of reaching closer. He took the box, but before he walked away, Amelia said softly, "Whoever she was." Caleb stopped. She must have mattered. His hand tightened around the wooden box. Then he disappeared into the dark hallway, and Amelia understood something. Caleb Morgan was not a man who had forgotten how to love. He was a man who had been afraid to remember. For several days after Amelia found the old wooden box, neither of them mentioned it again. That silence became something they both understood. Caleb did not ask questions about what she had seen. Amelia did not ask about the woman whose name rested on that old letter. Instead, they returned to the small routines that had slowly formed between them. Morning coffee beside the stove, the sound of horses moving in the barn, the creak of the front gate when the wind pushed against it. Little things, the kind of things Caleb had spent years convincing himself he did not need. But he noticed them now. He noticed when Amelia hummed quietly while repairing a torn sleeve. He noticed how she always placed tools back exactly where she found them. He noticed that when she laughed, it was never loud, but it changed the entire room. And that bothered him more than he wanted to admit, because a quiet life was supposed to stay quiet. Then Thomas Whitaker arrived. It was late morning when the rider appeared at the edge of Morgan Creek Ranch. The sky was pale gray, and a cold wind moved across the open fields. Caleb was repairing a section of fence near the southern pasture when he saw the horse approaching. He knew the rider before the man reached the gate. Whitaker did not travel alone. Two men followed behind him, not carrying trouble openly. Men like Whitaker rarely needed to. They carried expensive coats, clean boots, and the confidence of people who believed the world belonged to them. Caleb wiped his hands on his work gloves and walked toward the gate. Amelia stepped out of the house when she heard the horses. The moment she saw Whitaker, her expression changed. Not fear, recognition, the kind that came from knowing exactly what someone was capable of. Thomas Whitaker removed his hat. "Mr. Morgan," his voice was polite, almost friendly. Caleb had learned that the most dangerous men were often the ones who never raised their voices. "Mr. Whitaker." The ranch owner looked around. Small place. Caleb said nothing. Whitaker smiled. "Peaceful, though. I imagine that's why you chose it." His eyes moved toward Amelia. "And I imagine Miss Brooks has made things less peaceful than usual." Amelia stepped forward. "Say what you came to say." Whitaker looked amused. "Still carrying your father's stubbornness, I see." Caleb noticed Amelia's hand tighten slightly at her side, only for a moment, then she controlled it. "I have nothing to discuss with you." Whitaker reached inside his coat and removed a folded paper. "You do." He held it toward her, a final offer. Caleb looked at the paper. "She already answered you." Whitaker's eyes moved back to him. "And you must be the man she found to hide behind." The words hung in the cold air. Amelia looked at Caleb, not because she needed saving, because she was waiting to see what he would choose. Caleb stepped forward. Careful. One word. Quiet. But Whitaker understood. The wealthy ranch owner smiled. "There it is." He looked at Amelia. "The reason I was curious." Then he turned back to Caleb. 5 years ago, you learned what happens when a man fights people with deeper pockets." The air seemed to change. Caleb's face stayed still, but Amelia noticed the way his shoulders tightened. Whitaker continued. You lost faith in the system once. I wonder how long it takes before you lose faith in this little arrangement too. Amelia's voice became colder. Whitaker placed his hat back on. Of course, he turned his horse, then stopped. Oh, one more thing. He looked toward the ranch house. Everyone in Red Hollow already knows about your engagement. A pause. People are curious how long a lie can survive. Then he rode away. That afternoon, Caleb barely spoke. He worked longer than necessary. He repaired a fence post that did not need repairing. He checked horses that had already been checked. Amelia watched from the porch. Finally, she walked toward him. You want me to leave? Caleb kept working. If Whitaker thinks you're important to me, he will use that. He already is. Caleb stopped. The hammer rested in his hand. You don't understand what men like him do. Amelia looked at him. I understand exactly. The wind moved between them. My whole life, people have decided what I am worth before they know my name. Her voice remained calm. But I won't let Thomas Whitaker decide that again. Caleb looked away, because part of him believed she was right, and part of him was terrified she was. That evening they searched through Henry Brooks's old papers. The documents had been stored in a small wooden chest Amelia carried with her when she arrived. Receipts, land records, letters, notes written in her father's careful handwriting. Hours passed. Then Amelia found something. A folded page hidden beneath the false bottom of the chest. She opened it slowly. Caleb moved closer. The writing was Henry Brooks. His words were not long, but they changed everything. He had written about Whitaker, about land deals, about families who had lost their homes because of false contracts, and one sentence made Amelia stop breathing for a moment. Thomas Whitaker believes no one will ever challenge him because he thinks poor people have no voice. Caleb read the page again, then looked at Amelia. This is why he wanted your land. She shook her head slowly. No, her fingers tightened around the paper. This is why he wanted my father silent. The room became completely still. Outside, the first snow began falling over Morgan Creek Ranch. Amelia stared at the handwriting of the man she had lost. My father didn't die because of an accident. Caleb said nothing, because he knew from her face that she had already reached the same conclusion. 5 years ago, he lost someone because a powerful man believed nobody would ask questions. Now Amelia Brooks was standing in the same place, and for the first time in years, Caleb wondered if walking away had ever truly protected anyone. The next morning, Red Hollow would hear a new rumor. Not about Amelia, not about Caleb, but about the man who had spent years making everyone else afraid. Thomas Whitaker had finally found someone who was willing to look him in the eye. The next morning, Red Hollow felt different, not because the town had suddenly become brave, it had not. People still lowered their voices when Whitaker's name was mentioned. They still stepped aside when his carriage passed through the street. They still remembered the families who had lost their land after signing papers they barely understood. But something had changed. People had started talking, and Thomas Whitaker noticed. Caleb knew it the moment he rode into town that afternoon. The general store was quieter than usual. The men near the saloon stopped talking when he walked by. Even the blacksmith across the road seemed to be listening more than working. Rumors moved faster than horses in Red Hollow, and the newest one was that Henry Brooks had left behind something that could hurt Whitaker. Caleb found Elias Parker sitting alone inside his small law office near the church. The old lawyer looked tired. His desk was covered with papers, ink bottles, and old county records stacked higher than most men would bother reading. You found something, Elias said. It was not a question. Caleb closed the door behind him. How did you know? Elias looked toward the window. Because Thomas Whitaker came by this morning asking questions. Caleb's expression hardened. What kind of questions? The kind a man asks when he is afraid of the answers. Elias pulled out an old ledger. I worked for him years ago, prepared some contracts, filed some documents. He paused. I told myself I was only doing paperwork. Caleb looked at the ledger. But, Elias removed his glasses. But paperwork can ruin a person's life just as easily as a gun. The words stayed in the room. Before Caleb could respond, the office door opened. Amelia stood there. She had a wool coat around her shoulders. Her father's papers held carefully against her chest. I thought I should hear this too. Elias nodded. Your father trusted me. Amelia looked at him. Did he trust you enough? The old lawyer accepted the question. A silence followed, then he opened the ledger. Inside were copies of old agreements, names, dates, amounts, families who had borrowed money and somehow ended up losing their homes. Whitaker's method was simple. A person signed one thing. Then months later, a different number appeared. A different condition. A different reason why they owed more than they could ever repay. Amelia placed her hand over the page. My father found this. Elias nodded. He planned to bring it to the county judge. What happened? Nobody answered immediately, because they all knew. Henry Brooks never made it there. That evening, Caleb and Amelia returned to Morgan Creek Ranch under a darkening sky. Snow covered the fence lines. The horses moved slowly through the cold air, their breath visible in the fading light. When they reached the house, Caleb noticed Amelia was quieter than usual. He placed more wood into the stove. She stood near the window. You think my father knew he was in danger? Caleb looked at her. I think he knew someone wanted him to stop. She turned, and he didn't. No. Caleb's voice was low. Sounds like him. A small sadness crossed her face. For a moment, she was not the woman who stood against Whitaker in the street. She was simply a daughter missing her father. Caleb walked to the table and placed a cup of coffee near her. She looked at it. You remembered how I take it. Caleb looked away. 2 spoons of sugar. A quiet smile touched her face. You notice a lot for someone who says nothing. Caleb almost answered, but the moment disappeared when a sound came from outside. A horse, then another. Caleb reached for his coat. Amelia stood immediately. No. He looked at her. You stay here. She shook her head. You don't get to protect me by leaving me behind. The words stopped him because he knew she was right. Together they stepped outside. Thomas Whitaker sat on his horse near the gate. This time he was alone. No men beside him. No witnesses. Just a man who believed he could still control the conversation. Mr. Morgan. Caleb stood near the porch. Whitaker. The ranch owner looked toward Amelia. I came to offer one final kindness. Amelia laughed softly, not because it was funny, because she could no longer believe him. Kindness? Whitaker ignored her. Walk away from this, Caleb. Let Miss Brooks handle her family's problems. Caleb's eyes remained steady. And if I don't? Whitaker looked around the ranch. Then you lose this place. The words were calm, certain. Your supplies become harder to purchase. Your neighbors become less willing to help. Your little ranch becomes another forgotten piece of land. Amelia stepped forward. You think everyone has a price? Whitaker looked at her. No, a pause. I think everyone has a breaking point. Caleb moved slightly closer to Amelia, not touching her, not making a show, just standing there. Whitaker noticed. And for the first time, his confidence slipped. Only slightly, but enough. You really believe she is worth losing everything for? Caleb looked at Amelia, then back at Whitaker. I believe some things are worth standing for. Whitaker stared at him, then turned his horse. "You should have stayed out of this, Morgan." The ranch gate closed behind him, but the threat remained. 3 nights later, the storm arrived. The wind came down from the mountains hard enough to shake the old cabin windows. Caleb woke before the sound reached the house. Something was wrong. A smell, smoke. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The barn was glowing against the darkness. Fire moved along the eastern wall. The horses were restless inside. "Amelia!" The door opened behind him. She was already there. Her father's papers were in one hand, a lantern in the other. Caleb looked at her. "Get back inside." Shaw shook her head. "My horses are in there." He knew then. She was not going to run, not this time. Together they moved toward the barn, not as strangers, not as a pretend couple, but as two people who had already chosen the same fight. And somewhere beyond the smoke and the falling snow, Thomas Whitaker had made the mistake of believing fear was stronger than courage. The fire at Morgan Creek Ranch burned against the winter night like a warning written across the valley. Caleb moved first. He ran toward the barn with his coat open, snow collecting on his shoulders, while Amelia followed close behind, carrying a bucket before he could tell her not to. The old wooden doors shook from the frightened horses inside. Caleb forced one side open. "Stay back." Amelia looked at him. "You know I won't." For a second, neither moved. Then Caleb nodded, not because he wanted her in danger, because he finally understood she had never been waiting for someone to save her. They worked together. Caleb released the horses one by one while Amelia guided them away from the smoke and toward the fenced pasture. The cold air filled with the sounds of hooves, rushing footsteps, and the crackle of burning wood. Near the eastern side of the barn, Caleb noticed movement. A figure trying to disappear into the darkness. "Stop!" The man froze. Caleb stepped forward. The stranger wore a heavy coat and carried a lantern that had fallen into the snow. Amelia recognized him first. "Dale." The man's face changed. He looked down. "I didn't want it to go this far." Caleb kept his distance. "Who sent you?" Dale said nothing, but silence answered for him. Amelia stepped closer. "Was it Whitaker?" The man looked away. That was enough. Later, with the sheriff on his way from Red Hollow, Dale finally admitted what had happened. Whit had ordered the fire, not because he wanted the ranch, because he wanted the papers gone, the documents Henry Brooks left behind, the evidence that could expose years of dishonest land deals. Caleb listened quietly. For years, he had imagined the moment he would finally face the man responsible for so much pain. He thought it would feel like victory. Instead, standing in the snow beside a damaged barn, he only felt tired. The next morning, Red Hollow woke to a story nobody expected. Thomas Whitaker was no longer just a wealthy ranch owner. He was a man with questions following him. Elias Parker arrived at Morgan Creek Ranch before noon with a leather folder under his arm. "The county judge will hear this," he said. Amelia looked at the papers. "My father's records?" Elias nodded. "Your father's records, the old contracts, the names of families who lost land." He looked toward Caleb and the testimony from last night. Caleb stared toward the burned section of the barn. "He'll fight." Elias gave a tired smile. Men like Whitaker always do. 3 days later, the courthouse in Red Hollow was full. People who once avoided looking at Whitaker now sat in the wooden benches and listened. Farmers, hands, shop owners, families who had spent years believing they were alone. Whitaker entered wearing a clean black coat, the same confidence, the same calm expression. But this time people did not move aside, they watched. Elias presented the documents, one by one, date by date, name by name, The room became quieter with every page. When Whitaker finally spoke, his voice remained controlled. All of this is based on the word of people who are angry. Amelia stood, not quickly, not dramatically, she simply stood. My father kept records because he believed the truth should survive even when people don't. The room went silent. She placed the final document on the table. This is his handwriting. Her fingers rested on the paper for a moment. Then she stepped back. Whitaker looked at Caleb. You think you won? Caleb looked at him. No. A pause. I think people finally stopped being afraid. Those words stayed longer than any argument could. By sunset, Whitaker's control over Red Hollow had begun to disappear. Not all at once. Things rarely changed that way in the West, but the first fence post had fallen, and sometimes that was enough. Weeks passed. Winter settled over the mountains. Morgan Creek Ranch slowly returned to life. The damaged barn was repaired. The horses returned to their stalls. The fields became quiet again. One evening, Caleb stood on the porch holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Amelia. She looked at him. You remembered. He shrugged. 2 spoons. She smiled. For a while they watched the snow-covered hills without speaking. The silence was different now. It was no longer empty. Finally, Amelia said, I suppose our arrangement has served its purpose. Caleb looked at her. She looked down at the cup in her hands. The town believes the engagement was real now. A small breath left her. But we both know how it started. Caleb was quiet. Then he said, at first, yes. She looked up, but not anymore. The wind moved through the trees, the same sound that once filled Caleb's lonely evenings. Only now, it did not feel so lonely. Amelia smiled softly. You know, you never actually asked me. Caleb frowned slightly. Asked you what? If I wanted this to be real. For the first time in years, Caleb Morgan looked uncertain. Not because he was afraid of a fight. Not because he was afraid of losing land. Because this mattered more. He set his cup down. Then he reached for her hand. The same hand that had grabbed his arm in the dusty street weeks earlier. Only this time, she was not asking him to pretend. Amelia Brooks, he said quietly, I don't want a woman standing beside me because she has nowhere else to go. He paused. I want you here because you choose to be. Her eyes softened. And if I choose you? Caleb looked toward the ranch, the house, the barn, the land they had fought for. Then I think I finally have a home. She answered with a smile. A real one. The following spring, Morgan Creek Ranch looked different. Not because it was bigger, because it was alive. Amelia opened a small room beside the ranch house where neighbors came for medicine, advice, and help. Caleb rebuilt the fence lines with her beside him. They still disagreed. She still challenged him. He still pretended not to enjoy it. But everyone in Red Hollow noticed something. The man who once lived like he was waiting for the world to disappear had finally found a reason to stay. And the woman who once walked into town with nobody willing to stand beside her had built a place where nobody could make her feel unwelcome again. Years later, people would still talk about the winter when Thomas Whitaker lost his power. But the story they remembered most was not about the man who fell. It was about the 2 people who stood. A cowboy who learned that protecting someone did not mean carrying every burden alone, and a woman who learned that love was not something given out of pity. It was something chosen every day. At Morgan Creek Ranch, beneath the Montana sky, Caleb Morgan and Amelia Brooks stopped pretending. And that was when their real story began. Sometimes, the hardest part of a person's journey is not surviving the storm. It is believing there can still be something waiting after it passes. Imagine standing where Caleb stood, carrying years of regret, believing that keeping your heart closed was the only way to avoid losing again. Or imagine being Amelia, holding on to the last pieces of your family's legacy, while wondering if anyone would ever stand beside you without asking what you could give in return. Their story reminds us that healing does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly, through a hand held at the right moment, a person who chooses to stay, and a place where you finally feel you belong. Caleb and Amelia did not find each other because life was easy. They found each other because they both understood what it meant to keep going when the world gave them every reason to stop believing. If you were in Caleb or Amelia's place, what choice would you have made? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories of courage, second chances, and love that survives the hardest seasons speak to your heart, consider subscribing and staying with us. There are many more forgotten paths, hidden truths, and heartfelt journeys from the old frontier still waiting to be discovered in the stories ahead.